right, let's get started. I think you can see from the overhead where we're going to be at this morning, so go ahead and turn to Mark. You turn to Mark chapter 1. It's all right. Good to see you out. Is it a sign of old age when you don't know what day it is? So, okay, Sabrina's saying it. So Sabrina, sometimes you don't know what day it is? Okay, then good. I go up to my study this morning, come down about, 7:45. Ask Martha, what are you dressed for? It's Sunday. I said, no, it's Saturday. I had to go look at my phone. I didn't believe her. I thought she was the one that was wrong. You don't have. It don't matter. Well, it's already been one of those days. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for the morning. We're thankful, Father, that we can come together and worship you. We pray that blessings be upon us, each and every one who's assembled, that we might open your word and study from it. We're thankful, Father, for what you've left for us to study from, to guide us in our lives, to tell us about Jesus Christ. We're thankful, Father, for those writers who did so, who were inspired by the Spirit to write down things that we can still read to this day. We pray that you'll bless us in our study this morning. May we open your word and rightly divide it. May it become a part of our lives where we're missing. And may people see Christ living within us. In his name we pray. Amen. All right, let's be honest. Out of all the Gospels, whose favorite Gospel is the Gospel of Mark? That's your favorite one. I'm not surprised. Why is that? Why is it that out of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I had a chance of 1 out of 4, but no one raised their hand about the book of Mark. Why not Mark, of all things? Why did we kind of skip over that? In fact, I saw where somebody was writing that he said, we read Matthew, and then we skip to Luke, and then we read John, and we go to Acts, and we skip Mark. Why did we skip Mark for? Well, probably because it's the shortest gospel. In fact, I've got the word counts here. In the book of Luke, there are 1,151 verses. In Matthew, there's 1071. In John, 879. In Mark, there are 661. So almost half verses found in Mark that we find over in the book of Luke. I think maybe we skip over it because of the repetitiveness that we find between Matthew and Mark's especially, and then even with Luke, we find some repetitiveness, and we'll talk about that as we go through our lesson here, who actually wrote first and who borrowed from who. But Mark is one of those books we kind of skip over. Until recently, Marcus was kind of the stepchild, but now Mark is kind of getting more attention, I believe. There's more things being written about Mark lately. And you'll see more commentaries on the book of Mark, and people have things to say about this book, which makes it unique from the others. And so this morning we're going to talk about the book of Mark. Who wrote the book of Mark? Who's buried in Grant's tomb? Mark. We know him by two names, though, don't we? What's the two names we know Mark by? John Mark. Yeah, John Mark. Yeah. And we're going to read about John Mark. He's mentioned, I think, 8 times in our New Testaments. He is mentioned more than anyone else as far as writers, I believe, other than John, of course, the apostles. But Mark's mentioned 8 times in the New Testament, 4 times in the book of Acts, and 4 times in the epistles. And we'll look at those places that he has certainly mentioned that. What do we know about Mark? Let's see what we know about Mark himself here. Who was Mark's mother? Mary, thank you. Yeah, Mary. Yeah. I think it was my class at ABS. I told my class, if you're ever in a class where they ask the name of a woman, always say Mary, because chances are you're going to get it right. And that's the truth with Mark here. Mark's mother's name was Mary. We know this from Acts chapter 12, I believe. It's where we find this out at. We know anything about what type of family Mark came from? By the way, his father's never mentioned, so we don't know who his father is, only his mother. Anything about his family you know about from Acts chapter 12, perhaps? Acts chapter 12. Is there anything in Acts chapter 12 that kind of tells us about Mark, about his family, perhaps?
There were Christians gathered there to pray when Peter was in
Yeah, there were Christians gathered there while Peter was incarcerated to pray. Probably Mark came from a family of some means of wealth, perhaps. There's a girl's name in Acts chapter 12 who's mentioned who was a servant girl. Remember her name? Yeah, Rhoda? Yeah. She's the one that when Peter gets to the door, she looks and she's so excited she can't believe. As Peter goes back and tells and leaves Peter standing out, outside the gate there. So she might have been a woman of wealth. We know where she lived, where Mark was from, perhaps. Thought that he was probably from Jerusalem, that he was from Judea, from Jerusalem down there. So the church was meeting perhaps in her house. At least they were gathered there for prayer. Let me give you a couple of speculations about that house. There are some who believe that's where the Last Supper took place. Now again, we're not told. All we know about where that location was at was what we find in the Gospels about being an upper room, about how the house was found, and things such as that. It's never said this is the house of Mary, who's the mother of John Mark, nothing like that. But there was some speculation concerning that. And so we know his mother's name. Tell me somebody else who was a member of the family of Mark. Barnabas. Yeah, Barnabas. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you receive instruction. If he comes to you, welcome him. And so you've got a connection with Barnabas. Now, where was Barnabas from? Where was Barnabas from? He owned land there. Yeah, Cyprus. Yeah. You been to Cyprus? Y'all been to Cyprus? Anybody been to Cyprus in here? I'm not talking about Cyprus, Tennessee, by the way. That's just up across the line there. Cyprus was, in that day and age, that was like going to Hawaii, maybe for us. That was a paradise for people of of the Mediterranean area, Cyprus. And so Barnabas was from that place, owned land on Cyprus, which again would be akin to owning land on Hawaii, if you know what the price of the land are in Hawaii. But that's where Barnabas is from. So there's the connection with Barnabas there, with John Mark. Mary was his mother. So we know something about his family. How about his failures? In Acts chapter 12, Barnabas and Paul take John Mark with them. Remember? They've come back. There, it says in verse, I think it's 25, Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry. And they also took with them John, whose surname was Mark. And so they're going to take John Mark with them as they're going back out now into the field to preach. The first place they come to, of all places, is the Isle of Cyprus. Yeah, they come to Cyprus. And so if you know your geography, you know that Cyprus is an island there in the Mediterranean Sea. And so as they would travel, they would go up to Cyprus, and they were going to cut from there over to what was now Turkey. They get to Cyprus, and then their intention was to go on to the mainland. But what happens? Well, John Mark, for some reason, and we're never told the reason, by the way, refuses to go. Now, we can speculate all we want here. This is found in chapter 13 and verse 13 of Acts, that it might have been his youth. We think of him being young at this time. It might have been knowing that he was leaving Cyprus, a paradise, to go to Turkey, which was like a slum, that he decided that he'd rather stay there. But he goes back to Jerusalem. We're not told, but we do see in that basis, in that instance there, that he does. There's a failure involved in that. And we know so often that sometimes failures are turned into something perhaps even good. We know that later on, when Paul and Barnabas are getting together, they're traveling company to go back out. This is found over in Acts chapter 15. Let me just read you this, verse 37 through 39 there. It says, Now Barnabas was determined to take with him John called Mark, but Paul insisted they should not take with them the one who had departed from them when they went to Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Then the contention became so sharp that they parted from one another, and so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. And so because of John Mark's failure earlier in leaving them high and dry, and Barnabas wanting to take him again on a trip, Paul said, well, wait a minute. This is the guy that, abandoned us the first time we took him out there. I don't want him to go with us. We need somebody more dependable. And depending on the translation you're reading from, the sharp contention that took place here, there was an argument that took place And Barnabas said, okay, I'll take him, I'll go one way. And Paul said, I'll go the other way and I'll take Silas with me. So can we not say that because of something perhaps missing with John Mark at this time, in his character certainly, and maybe even in his courage, that this came out for the better? You've got a dividing then of the work. You've got now two gospel preachers that are no longer and traveling together. They're going separate ways, and thus the work is now doubling that was being done for the cause of Christ, because Barnabas takes John Mark with him. And then John Mark kind of falls out of sight for a little bit. In fact, I think in the book of Acts, this is the last place we read about him there in that chapter 15. But then he pops up again. And he pops up in what I call his fellowships. And what I mean by that is the association that we later read about John Mark having. And the first one is with a guy that you would think would be the last one that want to have fellowship with John Mark, and that is Paul. Go to Philemon chapter 1. Go to Philemon chapter 1. You know, if you got everybody here use Bible Gateway. Yeah, I love Bible Gateway because it's so easy to navigate around, but you got to put in Philemon chapter 1, otherwise it won't give you anything, you know. Philemon chapter 1, look at verse 24 there. Verse 24, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, greets you, as do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, and my fellow laborers. And so we believe this is the same Mark, John Mark here, that is now associated with Paul. And Paul talks about him being a fellow laborer with him. In fact, he's sending greetings from this man and others to Philemon here. Look in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10 again. I've read this already, but why I bring this up is because, again, we see him connected with people here, Aristarchus, and then John Mark. Again, Mark is mentioned there as being with him. And so somewhere along the line, Mark joins with Paul in some of his travels, and seemingly is with him in his imprisonment later on, or has some connection with him here. The last place that Paul ever mentions John Mark is in 2 Timothy chapter 4. What is it about 2 Timothy? What do we think about when we think about 2 Timothy chapter 4, folks, in regards to Paul? What is 2 Timothy chapter 4 in connection to Paul? Everybody should know this. Yeah, this is the last words, all right? These are the last things that Paul wrote, as far as we know. It's 2 Timothy chapter 4. And in that chapter, Paul talks about he's being poured out, you know, he's ran the race, he's ready to die, but there's some people he would love to see. He talks about the fact that only Luke is with him, but there's some folks he would love to see, and people he mentions there. He mentions about one who had departed from him, and that was Demas. We just read about Demas back over in Philemon there, who was, spoken of highly there, but in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he's one who has departed and went back into the world. But we've got the name of Mark. Look at verse 11. Only Luke is with me. Greet Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry. So, Timothy, get a hold of Mark and bring him with me. Get him here. I'm in Rome. Don't have much time. Bring him with you. And so we've got the fellowship that John Mark has eventually with Paul. But there's another one. And this may be even more significant. It's the fellowship that John Mark had with Peter. Go to 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5. Let's just read what it says down there in verse 13. Let's see if we can make some comment about Peter's connection with John Mark. Now, again, the association with Peter goes back, you'd have to say, to Acts chapter 12, where Peter, after being released from prison, miraculously winds up there at the house of Mary. And seemingly Peter knew where to go, didn't he? And that might have been because that was a place where people would gather together to pray or even to worship. But in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, Peter writes, she who is in Babylon. Does everybody have the word Babylon there? Everybody has the word Babylon? What is probably, though, we should understand Babylon to be? If we think about real Babylon of the Old Testament, I think we're probably talking about Rome, actually. This comes up in the book of Revelation. Babylon is associated, I believe, with Rome. elect together with you, greets you, and so does Mark, my son. Mark, my son. And so here you've got Peter talking about Mark in a relationship of like a father-son type of relationship. Even closer to what we see over there in Paul's writing, where Paul talks about him, being a fellow with him, a fellow worker. Here Peter talks about him in ways that a father-son would speak about one another. And so we've got this fellowship here with Peter also. There is an embarrassing situation that takes place, and it's only found in the book of Mark. Let me show you where this is. Go to Mark chapter 15. I'm sorry, Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. But this is only found in the book of Mark, and why I bring this up is because people think, many scholars believe this is Mark here, okay? And you probably read this before, and probably read it and just went on, oh, that's an embarrassing situation. But there are many people who believe that this was John Mark here. Look at verse 51. Of course, now we've got the Last Supper has taken place. You've got Christ. He's been arrested. Verse 51, now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young man laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. And so it's thought that this might have been Mark. And again, we don't have anything outside of this record here in Mark chapter 14. And why most people believe it's Mark is because Mark knew about this personally and wrote that in his gospel then. This embarrassing moment that took place in his life. So that's all we really have about Mark as far as the background, the family, the failures, the fellowship of this man here that wrote our second book in our New Testament. Let's talk now about the source for his gospel. Was Mark an apostle? No. Was he a disciple? Yeah, he was a disciple. Yeah. His mother's probably was a first-generation disciple. And so we've got Mark. What was Mark's source for his gospel then? How many non-apostles wrote the Gospels? That's maybe the best question to ask right off the bat. How many non-apostles? Non-apostles. 50%. Yeah, thank you. Which means half. Half of them were non-apostles. The two apostles would be John and Matthew, and then Luke and Mark were not apostles. And when we talk about Luke, we'll talk about his source that he used for writing his gospel here. But most people, and I say most scholars and those who've done a lot of study on these books, and knowing from history, believe that Peter was the source of Mark's gospel. Now, here's the evidence that is given. Here's many church fathers. Somebody speak up.
Historians in the first few centuries.
Yeah. Christians who became historians, who wrote down a lot of things that were not inspired, but they wrote histories that help us understand how people back then were thinking and what they thought about. And I think that's important sometimes, especially with source material and maybe background material that we use sometimes in our studies. But the church fathers had this belief that John Mark was the writer of the book of Mark. And as far as I know, there has never been a scholarly challenge made that Mark didn't write his gospel. Meaning that no one has ever said, hey, wait a minute, somebody else wrote this book. It wasn't the guy, it wasn't Mark who wrote this. He might have stuck Mark's name on there, but it wasn't written by Mark. No, nobody's ever challenged that. And you've got statements, I've got a couple of people's names here. Irenaeus called Mark a disciple and interpreter of Peter, meaning he believed that Peter wrote was the source of Mark's gospel. Another quotes John, the apostle, who claimed that Mark wrote this gospel using Peter as a source. And here's a little interesting thing here that I find here. And I'm just read, this was a statement made. It says, it's unlikely that the early church would have assigned the authorship of a gospel to a person of secondary or even questionable history as John Mark, since he was neither an apostle nor a person of prominence in the early church, if he didn't have a connection with Peter. I found that interesting, that even back then, that John Mark's connection with Peter was more important to them, perhaps, accepting this gospel here as being inspired and thus full of things that we ought to read. And the connection, of course, is with Peter there. And then I've just simply got his connection to Peter. Acts 12, Peter comes to the house there. Here's some things in the book of Mark that that we don't find maybe some of the other Gospels. That Mark omits references to Peter found in some of the other Gospels. And I've got a whole list of things here that are found in other Gospels that Mark doesn't deal with. But then he includes things about Peter, specifically about Peter, that are not found in the other Gospels. He uses unique words, such as the words, and Peter. It's as if somebody's sitting down and they're saying, now here's what happened over here, all right? And here's what happened to us over there. But here's what happened to me, maybe personally. And so Mark writes those things down, and we have those in the book here. And the unique words, and Peter, in chapter 16, verse 7, that are included there, making sure that he was one of those there associated with them. There's also, and I found this interesting, when you think about the sermons of Peter, where would you go to for the first sermon that we have recorded of Peter? I can go to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2. But we also have an outline of a sermon that Peter delivered to Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. And if you go back and look at the things that Peter says to Cornelius, scholars have said, you know what, the book of Mark follows the outline of Peter. That Peter gives the major points of all the things that took place. The ministry of Jesus, on down, boom, boom, boom. And when we come to the book of Mark, and that's what we find in the book of Mark, those are the main topics. And so again, it's that connection with Peter that people are saying that Peter is then the source. How about the first-hand knowledge? First-hand knowledge simply comes from Peter. He displays that touch of first-hand knowledge. And he didn't have first-hand knowledge. So somebody certainly who had been there and experienced the things that Peter had experienced could have told Mark then all these various things. Look in the first part of your book of Mark there and tell me what date you have there in your text for the book itself. I know some some translations have a date there. See what date you have there. Normally right up at the very beginning there. Dawson, yours have one?
64 to 68.
64 to 68. Anybody else got anything different?
50 to 60.
50 to 60. Anything else? All right, so what have we found here? 50 to 68. Put them all together. Why I bring that up is because I've got ones different than that. I've got 57 to 59 or 62 to 64. Now, I bring that up is because they don't know exactly, perhaps, when it wrote, but here's what they do believe, that Mark was the first gospel written. They believe that Mark was the first gospel written. And that's why we have these dates. Now, there's a significance in the dates that were read, 50 to 60, 64 to 68, whatever. What took place in AD 70? Yeah, destruction of Jerusalem. So they believe at least it happened before that, the writing of the book itself. And if that's true, if Mark is the first written to, who's it written to? I think last week we talked about Matthew was seemingly a purely Jewish type of gospel written to first century Jews. But who was Mark written to? Who's the receivers of the book of Mark? Anybody know? Gentiles, but what specific Gentile? Daryl? Yeah. We always say Gentile, okay? Gentiles, that's a lot of fun. We're Gentiles, okay? But seemingly it was more specifically written to those in Rome. That he wrote his gospel for people in Rome. And I think there's some things in the book itself here that comes up that may lead us to that conclusion that this was written perhaps to a church in Rome and the things they were going through at that time there. As far as being written to Gentiles, let's talk about that first here. You think about the fact that in the book of Mark, he rarely quotes from the Old Testament. Rarely. Look at Mark chapter 1. I think this may be the only place he actually quotes from the Old Testament. Look at Mark chapter 1. Look at verses 1 through 3 there. In the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, as is written in the prophet, behold, I will send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you, and the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Who was he quoting from? Isaiah, right. He's quoting from Isaiah there. And I think there may be one other, but I think that is it, perhaps, in the book of Mark. Now, why not quote from the Old Testament? Yeah, you write a bunch of things that come from the Old Testament, and the Gentiles reading that says, well, this don't mean nothing to me, And so he's writing to Gentiles and perhaps those in Rome, and so he keeps his comments out of the Old Testament to a very minimum. And I think that explains, perhaps, again, why we believe this is written to Gentiles and even those maybe in Rome. Here's another reason. He explains Jewish terms and customs. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, here, you're dealing with things that are happening down in Judea, Jewish things, but you're writing to a Gentile, okay? Right? I'm trying to think of for instance here. I've been to a few countries, but I'm trying to think of a good instance here. Well, if you've ever been to a foreign country, they do things maybe different sometimes. They have different terms, they have different customs, all right? You're writing back to somebody in the United States, never been in that country. Well, maybe it might be wise for you to explain what's happening, over there, why they do this. That's Mark. Mark writing to a Gentile audience, he's going to talk about Jewish things. Well, I better explain, what that means. Let me give you some examples of this. Mark chapter 7, verse 3. Mark chapter 7, verse 3. Mark explains in detail about Pharisees' tradition in washing hands. In detail. Now, he wouldn't have to do that writing to a Jew, would he? A Jew would understand that. Mark chapter 14, verse 2. He explains that the first day of the unleavened bread is when they sacrifice the Passover lamb. And again, Jew, he would understand that. Mark chapter 15, verse 42, the day of preparation was the day before the Sabbath. And so Mark explains things to an audience that would not have understood those things. They were not brought up in that culture in that way. And so, again, it's evidence, I believe, that it was written to Gentiles. Here's one interesting thing. Roman time is used. Well, what time are we on? What time are we on, Brian? That's not the answer I wanted. But you're all right. All right, where do we get our Central Standard Time from, though? There was two ways time was traced back there, wasn't it, in the New Testament? There's Roman time, and then what's the other time? Jewish time, all right? We are Jewish or Roman time. Brian says we are Roman time. Thank you. We are on Roman time, aren't we? Why do I know we're on Roman time? What do I know, Gerald?
We count time from midnight.
Yeah, we count time from midnight to midnight. That's why. That's Roman time. That's how Mark tracks time here. Let me give you those places. Chapter 6, verse 48. Chapter 13, verse 35. He's using Roman time here. Here's another one. Aramaic translated into the Greek. Aramaic terms. Mark chapter 3, verse 17. John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name of Boanerges, that is the sons of thunder. He translates that. Found again in chapter 5, verse 41 there. And so he's translating things that they would not have been familiar with, perhaps. Latinized words that he uses in forms of speech. Look at Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. Remember when Christ comes to the land of the Gadarenes, and he meets the man there who's full of demons. What does the man say his name is there in Mark chapter 5? It says his name is what? Legion. Yeah, Mark's the only one who records that. That's a Latin word. And he uses those Latin phrases in places there, Latinized terms and such forms of speech there that are used. We find this in chapter 6, 12, 15, and so on. But here's one I want you to look at. He's the only writer to mention Rufus. Who was Rufus? Besides a rock band back in the 70s. Who was Rufus? Who's Rufus?
Jesus, son of Simon.
Rufus. All right, who was Simon then? Yeah, go to chapter 15, verse 21. Thank you, Darrell. Go to chapter 15, verse 21. And this is Christ on the way to Golgotha, and they compelled a certain man named Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by to bear his cross. Now, why is it important that the name Rufus is mentioned there? Where does Rufus come up again at? Romans 16. Romans 16. As Paul closes the book we call Romans, he sends out a lot of greetings. And one of the people mentioned there is a man by the name of Rufus. Now, there may have been a slew of Rufuses back then. I don't know how popular that name was, but it is interesting that we have his name mentioned there. And you've got the name mentioned here in the book of Mark. And if he's writing to a congregation up in Rome, why not mention somebody who's got connection, you see? Why not mention something that happened to one of those guys' father back there at the crucifixion? And so it was written to Gentiles, and I think Gentiles, and maybe specifically even to those in Rome. The literary style of Mark is interesting. And after reading this and then going back and reading some passages, you know, they're right. We're going to talk about probably Luke in 2 weeks. I'm going to do John next week. I'm going to swap them. And there's a reason behind that. But Luke is a doctor, all right? He's going to write in technical ways. John, you know, John was a fisherman. He writes in his way. Matthew, a tax collector, he writes in his way. But Mark, what was Mark's occupation? We don't know, do we? We don't know. We assume if he was brought up in a family of wealth that he would have had probably a pretty good education. We would assume that, don't we? But I've known a lot of kids who've come from wealthy backgrounds who are dumb as rocks. I mean, and they even talk when they open their mouth. They're not very wise. They're not very smart. Now, I don't want to say that that's Mark, but here's the thing about Mark. Mark's gospel, and again, I'm quoting scholars on this and people who've done a lot of study on this, is described as being elementary and unprofessional. In fact, one described it as crude, rustic, and non-literary in its style. But I like what another one had to say about Mark's writing. Mark writes in the style of conversation. Of conversation. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means when we have a conversation with one another, when we're talking as friends and what have you, chances are we're not going to try to impress one another with some big words, are we? We're just going to talk, you know. And we're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk in the way that people talk. That's Mark. Mark talks in the way people talked back then. He talked in the language of the common folks. And I think that's interesting because later on there in Mark chapter 12 there about Christ, it says about Christ was heard by the common people and they loved what they heard. They rejoiced. And so when Mark sat down and he wrote his gospel, he wrote as if he was having a conversation with somebody. And I'll tell you another thing I love about Mark. And this is the key word in the book of Mark. The word immediately. I think it's found like 35 times. Mark gets to the point. Mark gets to the point. He doesn't ramble on. He doesn't start back from the day he was born to make a point about something that happened to him yesterday. He gets to the point. And he gets to that point. And perhaps that's why his gospel is so short compared to the others. He gets to the point. And he talks about Christ in the sense of getting to the point. In the book of Mark, Christ is always on the move. He's always on the move. He's always doing something. In fact, in the book of Mark, I think there's only like 4 parables mentioned in the book itself, but 19 miracles in just a short span of chapters you've got in the book of Mark. And again, I think what it's saying is that he's on the move. He's here. He's not going to be here very long. And Mark wants us to see that and understand that Christ gets to the point when it comes to speaking and doing the things that he wants people to see in him and what he does. And so I like him for that. I love the fact about that. Mark presents Jesus as a servant. As a servant. Matthew presented Christ as a king. But Mark presented Jesus Christ as a servant. And I think that's interesting when you look at chapter 1 of Mark and compare it with chapter 1 of Matthew. We talked last week of the book of Matthew. How does the book of Matthew begin? It begins with what? The genealogy of Jesus Christ. How does the book of Mark begin? It doesn't begin with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, does it? In fact, we don't find anywhere in the book of Mark where we have the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Now, why is that? The reason why I believe is because Mark is not presenting Jesus as a king. like Matthew. He's not presenting Jesus as a man like Luke will, but he's presenting Jesus as a servant, as a slave. If someone comes and they want to, you put yourself back in the first century, right? You're a person of wealth. Someone comes, they say, I want to work for you. Do you ask them, well, who was your father? And who was your father's father? And how many generations can you go back? Probably you don't do that. What do you want to know if somebody's going to work with you? You want to know his work history, don't you? You want to know, you want his references. You want to know how well he works. It's going to be your servant. What John does is that John presents to us as Christ who is a servant. And so what we see then is he's serving throughout the book. I said 36 times the word immediately. We find that in chapter 1, Peter's mother-in-law, immediately the fever left her. Chapter 1, verse 42, immediately the leprosy left him. Over and over again, immediately. That's the type of servant you want, isn't it? Somebody who works and things are done. And so that's what Mark presents to us here. First 8 chapters contain 17 miracles in it. And only 4 parables, I think, are found in the entire book here. Each of the parables, though, deal with service. And so Mark presents to us that Christ, who is the servant. Now, let's very quickly look at the outline. Go ahead, Darrell.
There's actually another way of looking at that, too, and that is that those same things talk about Jesus' authority. And the word, it's not always used the same way, but the concept of authority shows up very, very often all the way through the book.
Mm-hmm.
Where Jesus is in charge. He's in charge of demons. He's
Right.
in charge of illnesses. He's in charge. So, because the Romans thought in terms
Of authority.
being in charge.
Yeah.
In charge.
That's a good point.
And so, I think Mark is actually trying to show, no, you just think you're in charge. Jesus is actually in charge.
That's a good point. Yeah, that goes again back with what we think is written to the Romans. Yeah, Doug.
Also, along with authority, Mark shows the power of this servant.
Yeah.
So, and the Romans understood power.
Yeah.
That's what they were all about. Who's powerful?
And again, I think he's dealing with things that they would understand, and could grasp, All right, real quick, the outline of the book of Mark here. You've got first the introduction. And again, this is the only place I believe where we've got a reference to the Old Testament here. It talks about John the Baptist. We've got the introduction of Christ. Then the Galilean ministry. I hope that's one thing you understand. When we think about the ministry of Jesus Christ, don't think in terms of Jerusalem only. In fact, think of that maybe kind of second. The most of his ministry was spent up in Galilee, where he came from. And then, of course, we've got him journeying to Jerusalem. And there's things said on that in those chapters. We've got his ministry there in Jerusalem itself there, which culminates, of course, in his death. And then, of course, in chapter 16, we've got the resurrection and then the commission of his apostles. And so that kind of outlines the book itself there. All right, any questions or comments then? Yeah, Doug.
One of the things about Mark that's interesting to me is that Paul threw him away at first, and Barnabas is the one who went back
Yeah.
and helped a brother who was rejected by others and brought him back into a situation where he became very useful.
Oh, Barnabas, I think we did him, if I'm not mistaken, lost in the credits, but he's a remarkable guy because you think about Acts chapter 9, he's the only one stood up for Paul. Yeah. Let me give you the key verse of the book of Mark. Key verse. Chapter 10, verse 45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. All right, next week we'll talk about John. All right? We'll talk about the book of John, or the writer, John the Apostle.